Hi, everyone, and I wanted to wish everyone a happy Father's Day today. And I thought before we jumped into the sermon, it would be a good moment just to recognize Father's Day and to just take a moment where we reflect on those who've been fathers to us and those who and the act of fathering itself. And we'll just take a moment of silence together in a moment. But I just wanted to acknowledge this day as we also do, and on Mother's Day, as we acknowledge that many people have many different relationships to our fathers and the act of fathering. And some of us have had incredibly positive experiences with fathers and fathering, and some of us have had some struggles with our fathers. Some of us have fathers who are deceased today. Some of us have wanted to be fathers and have unable to become fathers. Some of us are fathers in different ways. We may be adoptive or be stepfathers, and and everything in between. And so, I think it's important today, as we celebrate Father's Day, that we also recognize the wholeness of what it means to be in relationship with our fathers and to be a father and to engage and embrace the act of fathering, to hold it all and to welcome it all, so that whatever you bring to this day, you can bring it and have it on this day. So let us, in that spirit, take a moment of silence together to acknowledge fathers and fathering. Thank you and amen. There's a river flowing in my soul. There's a river flowing in my soul, and it's telling me that I'm somebody. There's a river flowing in my soul. There's a river flowing in my mind. There's a river flowing in my mind, and it's telling me that I'm somebody. There's a river flowing in my mind. There's a river flowing in my heart. There's a river flowing in my heart, and it's telling me that I'm somebody. There's a river flowing in my heart. Our opening words this morning come from our very own principles and purposes of our Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. And in this case, it's what we call the first principle, which goes like this: We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The fundamental belief in the value of the individual has long held a central place in liberal religion and finds a modern expression in our faith's first principle. As Unitarian Universalists, we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And such a conviction comes with specific meaning, serving to counter another ancient religious principle, which we know as original sin. Now, original sin teaches us that each of us is born in a state of sinfulness, fallen and unclean. And some interpret this as the simple imperfection of humanity, while others decry an inherent wickedness in us all. As both Unitarianism and Universalism were forming in America, the utter inequity of humanity was preached widely. And Calvinist Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, Sinner in the Hands of an Angry God, serves as a prime example of that theology. And he wrote, the God, and these are tough words, but he wrote, the God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like a fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times so abominable in his eyes as the most hateful and venomous serpent is in ours. You have offended him infinitely more than ever a stubborn rebel did his prince. And yet it is nothing but his hand that holds you from falling into the fire every moment. We need to kind of take a breath after that. But I think what's important to know is those words were commonplace. That kind of theology and belief system was very common as Unitarian Universalism and Universalism formed in the United States. And both of those traditions gained a stronghold in American society because of their response to, I think, what many of us would describe as a horrible theology. William Ellery Channing, who is another one of our ancestors and considered the father of Unitarianism, he delivered a powerful sermon entitled Likeness to God. And it was delivered at the ordination of a Reverend F.A. Farley, where Channing advised to this minister and all those who were present. Let the minister hold fast to a faith in the greatness of the human soul. That faith which looks beneath the vices of the sensual and the selfish and discerns in the depths of the soul a divine principle, a ray of the infinite light, which may yet break forth and shine as the sun. Let him strive to awaken in people a consciousness of the heavenly treasure within them. Very different words, very different theology and beliefs. And that's our tradition and our tradition's response to the hands of an angry God. John Murray, the founder of American Universalism, also strongly spoke out against beliefs in human depravity. And he said words that I think many of us know quite well. Go out into the highways and byways of America, your new country, and give the people blanketed with a decaying Calvinism, that's responding to Jonathan Edwards, something of your new vision. You may have but a small light. Uncover it, let it shine, use it to bring more light and understanding to the hearts and minds of people. Give them not hell, but hope and courage. Do not push them deeper into their theological despair, but preach the kindness and everlasting love of God. Again, very different sentiments, and both are traditions expressed in different ways, opposition to that theology of the day, which was quite prominent. Affirming the inherent worth of each person and every person serves as our great response to one of the most damaging theologies ever spoken. As Unitarian Universalists and religious liberals, it is something we can be proud of and continue to speak loudly when the times call for it, as they sadly so often do. Yet sometimes I think and I wonder if we misunderstand the fullness of our first principle. In a very success-driven society, I think we sometimes see it not so much as affirming our unconditional worthiness, but more as affirming a complete goodness in ourselves, allowing us to ignore the less savory aspects of our character. The affirming of our fundamental goodness has its value, but such an emphasis can also lead us to miss the most essential implication of our inherent worth, that we need not be good to be loved, that we need not be good to be loved. I think to know this truth is to be healed. It is to embrace wholeness over perfection. It is to honor ourselves not as we might be, but as we are. I think interpreting our inherent worth as our inherent goodness can lead us to be very fearful about owning up to our own mistakes, failures, even at times cruelty. Without a deep acknowledgement of our capacity for, to use the Christian term, sin, not original sin, but sin, we lack a useful theology of accountability, forgiveness, and even love. And yes, despite our inherent worth, despite our basic goodness, we each and every one of us do sin. The power of our first principle is not that we do not sin, but that even in our utter failings, even in our most horrible of mistakes, we are worthy of love. As a young man of 24, just entering seminary, I suffered deeply from an inability to embrace my failings. I resisted acknowledging all the wounds and weaknesses in myself, feeling the incredible need to be good, to be right, to be perfect in order to be loved. I went through a ministerial career assessment at that time, a required part of the process of becoming a minister, and was very nervous about the whole thing. And I was afraid to give the wrong answers on the psychological tests. And the therapist in that process asked me what my flaws were. And I didn't have the self-awareness to answer, at least not in the immediacy of that moment. And that whole process ended up being a very painful 3 days that ended with the group facilitator telling me that the therapist had placed a nickel bet with him that I wouldn't be able to handle ministry. As hard as it was, the experience for me began a very painful, yet ultimately liberating path of growing acceptance of myself, not as I want to be, but as I am, even when I fail, and even when I'm not liked. And of course, life seems to test these insights over and over again. And my departure from parish ministry and the eventual failure of my marriage was a perfect example of such a test. A bit over a decade ago, I was serving our congregation in Princeton, New Jersey, as its parish minister, and I fell in love and married a woman from Bloomington, Indiana. And we had dated many years before and parted ways, but we found each other again and began to see each other. She had 2 children, and the 3 of them eventually moved out to Princeton to live with me. And while the love felt strong over the course of our time together, I found myself more and more torn between the needs of my congregation and the needs of my new family. My wife desperately wanted to return to Bloomington, but I felt a deep call to continue to serve the Princeton congregation. My marriage suffered, my work suffered, and I struggled mightily and fiercely and arrogantly to hold on to both, yet never had enough to do either particularly well. After 3 years of struggling and a lot of arguments, I at last gave in, and we moved to Bloomington to raise our family near my wife's parents. And that whole experience was enormously painful because I was not enough, at least as I perceived myself and wanted myself to be, and never honestly probably could be enough in those circumstances, because there were needs that weren't possible to be met in that situation. But rather than acknowledge that reality, I pressed on, hurting both my family and the church, and I refused to see the inevitable. Letting go of ministry and letting go of that type of ministry, parish ministry, congregational ministry, truly was one of the most painful experiences of my life. I didn't expect to ever leave the parish ministry. I thought it was going to be my career till the end of my days. And as I made that choice, I realized the ministry meant more to me than as an act of service. Ministry also made me feel like I was a good person. And by leaving the ministry, I was not only giving up my work as a minister, but also my dream of one day being an important minister. And that was a very humbling awakening. Of some of my motives were about self-identity and ego. But it also, I think, that loss, that separation, that change and choice led me to a humbler life. We moved to the Bloomington during the height of the housing market crash and the economic recession, which was truly a horror in of itself. We had trouble selling our house in New Jersey. I didn't have any work, and we were living off a savings that was dwindling far too quickly. And during that time, I began to pick up the words of Jesus and spent a lot of time on his words on humility, especially spending a lot of time with the words, "The first shall be last, and the last shall be first." And I began to embrace myself in a different way during that time, not as a minister who dreamed of self-importance, but as a person separate from the drive to be good. And through that loss and my eventual divorce a few years later, because even the move was not enough to save our marriage, and also my shift into work with people experiencing poverty through Beacon, I found a much deeper love inside, both for myself and also for others. Through that humbling experience, that, if you will, strongly stated humiliating experience, there was an experience of great loss and sacrifice and breaking inside. You know, there are a variety of things that I find difficult with conservative Christianity, but I do believe that the Christian story, one of the things that it does exceedingly well, perhaps better than any religious tradition, is address our human capacity for failure. As the most obvious example, Jesus failed. Jesus was supposed to be the Messiah. He was supposed to take on the Romans and usher in a new kingdom of peace for the Jewish people. That's how people saw him at the time. But instead, he died. Mission not accomplished. And all kinds of beliefs following that death, which surprised many at the time who thought him to be the Messiah at the time. All kinds of beliefs evolved to turn Jesus's death into a victory, to somehow make it, into a win. Most notably, the belief that he died for his sins, that death was necessary because each and every one of us had sinned and he had to suffer the punishment for our sins. That he was the necessary sacrifice and only sacrifice that could atone for our original sin. But I find Jesus so much more powerful personally as someone who failed, who didn't usher in the kingdom of heaven on earth. The man who lived and loved, struggled and hurt, strived, succeeded, and failed. Jesus, as a metaphor for God, knows us in his humanness, knows us in his weakness, and knows us in his failure. I find that very powerful. While in seminary, I had a professor, Rosemary Chinichi, and she was also a Catholic nun. And she told me something fascinating, that she believed that the resurrection came too soon, that the 3 days was not enough time, that it was too fast, that people did not have enough time to sit in the loss, to be present to, if you will, the failure. And I think that's an incredibly powerful insight. When approaching the pain that comes with failure, I think many of us tend to find ways to pass over the experience quickly. When we're experiencing that pain from failure, I think many of us look for ways to pass over that experience very quickly, to not allow ourselves to be present and actually feel what we're feeling. We get busy, we criticize ourselves, we criticize others, we dive into some self-improvement project or another. We try to see the positive side. When we fail, any response we make that does not invite in our simple experience of failure, whatever that experience may be, removes us from the wholeness of who we are. In so doing, we reject that part of ourselves that does not know success, alienating ourselves from a very real part of our own humanity, damaging ourselves by withholding the love that we all deserve. And I want to read that again. When we fail, any response we make that does not invite in our simple experience of failure removes us from the wholeness of who we are. In so doing, we reject that part of ourselves that does not know success. We reject that part of ourselves that does not know success, alienating ourselves from a very real part of our humanity, damaging ourselves by withholding the love that we all deserve. It is certainly not in our interest to take failures and to use them as a means to belittle our worth, to beat ourselves up, and to damage ourselves, even though many of us do this, even though the greatest among us have known immeasurable failure. Yet I also think it is not in our immediate interest to take our failures and turn them into something positive, the lemons to lemonade approach. While this may have value over the long haul, it's important for us to learn and grow. To attempt to turn our failures too soon into something good can be another way of avoiding the pain of failure, and thus avoiding the healing that comes when we compassionately offer our presence to the hurt. This is why Rosemary Kenichi's idea of more time before the resurrection makes such sense. When we fail, we need to allow ourselves the time to do nothing with that failure, but feel it, to simply feel the pain or whatever other emotion we have going on, to experience the hurt. And in so doing, we allow ourselves to remain open and true to ourselves. For this is ultimately what love is all about. Compassion means to feel with, to feel with. When we feel our failures, when we allow ourselves to be present to them without trying to change them or alter them, we know compassion. We know love throughout all of us, the wholeness of who we are. And this, I believe, is the true meaning, the greatest gift of our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. You need not be good to be loved. You need not be good to be loved. And I believe this extraordinary gift bequeathed to us by our ancestors compels us to continue to offer this love to each other and our larger world, beginning with ourselves. May we surrender the need to be perfect, set aside the pretense of success all by itself, and enter into the humility of our full selves. We succeed and we fail. In the midst of both, let us show love. Shalom, amen, and blessed be.